I was the server who finally noticed that our tip money kept disappearing inside a column labeled rounding. I did not know yet that nightly closeout emails could prove it. My supervisor fired me for asking questions, and I will show how those reports brought her down. One Friday, our event agreement and written tip pool policy designated the private event service charge for the server pool, yet the payout came up short. When I asked about it, my supervisor smiled and called it a rounding issue. Later, she fired me for asking why the same gap kept appearing. Before all of that, I loved working there. After sunset, the dining room glowed, glasses chimed behind the bar, and the kitchen smelled of garlic, citrus, and hot bread. I was not rich, but I was proud of my work. I could carry 6 plates, calm an angry guest, and leave with cash I believed I had honestly earned. My supervisor knew how to make kindness feel like something she could take back. She spoke gently to a bride's mother, smiling as she promised that every detail was under control. Then, minutes later, she snapped at a dishwasher who asked where the clean towels were. Her voice went flat, and the whole back hallway seemed to go quiet around him. Private events were her territory. She handled the deposits, carried the envelopes to the office, and told the owners she had saved the evening whenever a banquet paid on time. If a server earned praise from a guest, she found a way to retell it as proof that she had trained them well. At first, I wrote her off as territorial. Restaurants collect people like that. Then I started listening whenever money came up. Our event agreements identified the service charge, and the restaurant's written tip pool policy designated that charge for the private event server pool. When a payout did not match those records, she tapped the checkout with one fingernail, dropped her voice, and blamed rounding errors in the system. She never walked us through the math. She made the question itself seem rude, like the server had accused her of something embarrassing. But the real record was already scattered through our inboxes and staff files. Each night, an automatic closeout email listed deposits, service charges, adjustments, and totals. The banquet team also received the governing event terms and tip policy. She could intimidate people face to face, but she could not charm records that had already been distributed. The night I finally questioned her, I tried to do it the proper way. I waited until service was over. The dining room was quiet, except for chairs scraping against tabletops and the ice machine coughing in the corner. I brought my checkout slip, the tip pool number, and the closeout email. I told her the amounts did not line up, then asked whether the private event deposit had been entered before or after the tip split. She stared at me as if I had set a dirty plate in front of a guest. Then she said I was creating drama, confusing newer servers, and accusing her of something I did not understand. I asked whether the owners could review the numbers. Her smile vanished. The next day, I was told I was no longer a good fit. I went home with my apron in a grocery bag and the bleach smell from closing side work still on my hands. I emailed the owners and explained that servers were being shorted and that I had documents. Their reply was polite, but it avoided the question. They said my supervisor handled event accounting and that small differences could happen when the system rounded totals. For a moment, I wondered whether I should let it go. I had lost my job, and I knew she could call me bitter. Then a former coworker texted me a photo of her checkout slip with the missing amount circled in blue pen. Another server sent one after that. The important thing was not my anger. It was that people had quietly kept records because they, too, believed something was wrong. At first, my plan was embarrassingly small. I only wanted to prove that I was not imagining it. I made tea, opened my laptop at the kitchen table, and dragged every nightly closeout email into one folder. Those emails carried dates, private event payments, service charges, adjustments, and payout totals. I did not call it revenge then. I called it checking. I compared each closeout with my checkout slips, then with the photos my coworkers sent. I wrote down only what the records showed. When a number matched, I marked it. When it did not, I highlighted the gap and noted which server had worked the event. I asked coworkers to send records they were allowed to keep, not guesses. Some sent payment screenshots, others sent wrinkled slips photographed on car seats after midnight. Then a former banquet lead sent the missing foundation, copies of the written event agreements distributed to the banquet team and the restaurant's tip pool policy. Those records designated the listed private event service charge for the server pool. I matched each agreement and policy term to its nightly report and the amount actually paid out. On event after event, the designated pool amount and server payouts came up short. The pattern alone did not answer where every dollar went, and I knew I had to be careful. It did establish what the servers were promised and what they received, so I moved slowly, kept the agreements, policy, closeouts, and payouts together, and let the full record speak before I did. The more records arrived, the less this felt like one missing payout with my name on it. It became a map of people who had been told to swallow a small loss and smile. I found shifts I had not worked, private parties I had only heard about, and names of servers who had already quit because the place felt wrong. The pattern reached across weekend banquets and private events, especially on nights when everyone had been running on coffee and burnt toast from family meal. That was the first real turn for me. I had assumed my supervisor was shaving numbers because she was careless, or because she was trying to cover her own mistakes. But the documents pointed somewhere colder. The deposits made her look valuable to the owners, while the missing server money could be dismissed as rounding. She got credit for bringing in cash. We got lectures about gratitude. One night, I sat in my dark kitchen while the refrigerator hummed and an old coworker's message lit up my phone. She said she had never complained because she needed the job and did not want to be called difficult. I understood that fear too well. I had already been fired for asking a question with paperwork in my hand. That was my breaking point. I stopped acting like someone begging to be believed and started building a case. I made a list of everyone who might still have records. I decided I would never give my supervisor another private conversation she could twist. If the truth reached the owners, it would arrive with names, dates, and totals lined up so clearly that ignoring it would be harder than reading it. Then my plan cracked before it was ready. A server who still worked there pulled me aside outside a grocery store. She kept looking over her shoulder, even though we were standing beside shopping carts and a stack of pumpkins, nowhere near the restaurant. Her hands stayed wrapped around the strap of her bag while she told me my supervisor had heard that people were comparing tip records. At the next pre-shift meeting, staff had been reminded that payroll information was private. They were warned that spreading rumors could cost them shifts and that former employees should stay out of restaurant business. Nobody had to say my name. Everyone knew who the message was meant for. The old fear came back fast. It was not only that people might stop sending me records. I had asked them to take a risk while I no longer stood beside them on the floor. My firing had become a warning to everyone else. If they helped me, they could be next. That night, I tried to retrieve one more batch of emails from my old work account. The login failed. I typed the password again, slower this time, then tried the reset link. Nothing worked. I stared at the error message until my eyes hurt, refreshing the page as if the account might suddenly open out of pity. I had saved a lot of closeouts, but not every one. Some dates existed only in that inbox. My supervisor still had the schedule, the office, the owner's trust, and a fresh way to paint me as a bitter former employee stirring up trouble. For nearly an hour, I considered deleting the folder and walking away. The cursor hovered over it while the traffic hissed along the wet street outside my window. I put the laptop down, then picked it up again. I could not decide whether I was protecting myself or abandoning everyone who had trusted me with their records. Then my phone buzzed against the table. A coworker had sent a message with no greeting. It said, "I have the emails you need, and I am tired of pretending the numbers are normal." That message changed the shape of the fight. I no longer needed to beg the restaurant for access. I needed to connect each server's record to the nightly reports we already had. the secret weapon was not a dramatic confession or one angry meeting. It was paperwork that could be checked line by line. So I changed how I worked. I stopped asking people for explanations and started asking for documents with dates. It took patience, especially on nights when I wanted one clean answer before sunrise. I would sit with the spreadsheet open, comparing times, names, and totals, until the numbers stopped blurring together. But I made myself one rule: no rumor went into the folder, and no guess went onto the spreadsheet. If someone said, "She always does this," I wrote nothing down until there was a checkout slip, a closeout email, or a message showing the actual number. I knew how tempting it was to grab onto anything that sounded convincing, but one bad claim could give my supervisor a reason to dismiss all of it. It was slow work, almost boring. That was exactly why it was safe. I told everyone they could blur personal details that did not matter. I was not trying to expose my coworkers. I was trying to protect them. Some records arrived at 2 a.m, after double shifts, with a brief note and a screenshot attached. I answered every message with the same promise: I will not use your name without permission. If you have ever been made to feel too small to question your own pay, subscribe and stay with me. Ordinary paperwork can protect the people nobody wanted to hear. And with every dated record that arrived, my supervisor had less room to hide behind a vague explanation. The trap I set did not look like a trap. It looked like a spreadsheet with too many tabs and a folder organized by date. I put each private event on its own line. I noted the event agreement, the policy-designated service charge, the nightly closeout total, the server payouts, and the difference that remained. At first, I hated how cold it looked. Every gap was somebody's groceries, gas, or rent money, but the coldness was the point. A spreadsheet could not be accused of crying for attention. My coworkers helped me check every entry. One read a closeout total over the phone, while I read the agreement and slipped back to her. Another sent the nightly report and payout screenshot. A former server found a banquet closeout I had never seen. With each linked document, the problem became less personal and harder to deny. Still, I hesitated before writing the owners again. I knew what sending that email could do to people who still needed their shifts. Was I protecting them by pushing this forward, or putting a target on their backs? What would you have done with policy-backed proof that coworkers were being shorted but feared speaking up? I sent the email anyway. I did not accuse my supervisor of anything I could not prove. I wrote that the designated service charge pool repeatedly exceeded documented payouts. I attached the agreements, policy, summary, closeouts, and payout records, then asked for a written explanation. She thought she was still defending herself against me. She did not know she was about to face the complete record. For 2 days, nothing happened. That silence was almost worse than being yelled at. I checked my email so often that my thumbs started to ache. Then a current server told me the owners had asked for copies of several nightly reports. My supervisor spent the afternoon in the office with the door closed. When she came out, she was cheerful in a way that made everyone nervous. Her first defense was the same old word, rounding. She told the staff the system made small adjustments, and that people who did not understand accounting were turning pennies into a scandal. But our documents did not show pennies. They showed private event after private event where the closeout amount and the amount paid to servers separated in the same direction. Then she tried loyalty. She told people the restaurant had been good to them and that complaints could hurt everyone. That landed differently now. The servers were exhausted, but they were not stupid. They knew the difference between protecting a workplace and protecting someone who took credit while they took less money home. The shift came when the owners replied to me. Their email no longer brushed off my concern as a former employee's complaint. They said they were reviewing the event closeouts. They asked whether the servers who shared records would be willing to confirm their own documents. My hands shook when I read it. I was still afraid of what this could cost people, and I knew I might be taking it further than I ever intended. But the door that had been slammed in my face had finally opened an inch. Now we had to decide who was willing to walk through it. The confrontation never happened with my supervisor glaring at me across a table. It happened in writing, which was where she was weakest. The owners asked for supporting records, and I sent the cleanest package I could make. For each event, the signed agreement and written tip pool policy sat beside the matching nightly closeout, server confirmations, and payout records. Each discrepancy listed the date, the service charge designated for the pool, the amount paid to servers, and the remaining gap. The package mapped every figure back to a specific agreement and policy clause, so no service charge stood alone without its governing terms. The automatic closeout timestamps showed the deposits and adjustments before anyone could rewrite the story in a meeting. My supervisor could not credibly say the reports were invented later, and she could not call the designated service charge optional when the governing document said otherwise. When the owners asked her to explain specific lines, her answer got smaller. She stopped talking about general rounding and started saying some events must have been entered differently. I wanted dates, calculations, and the adjustment history for each number. Every vague answer made our linked records stronger. For the first time, she had to answer details instead of managing everybody's mood. That was when we filed the wage complaint. It was the next step after being ignored, fired, warned, and dismissed. We attached the written policy, matching event agreements, nightly reports, server payouts, and owner's request for confirmations. For weeks, my supervisor had treated paperwork like background noise. Now the complete chain was speaking louder than either of us could. The reckoning arrived without shouting or any of the satisfaction I had pictured during my angriest nights. It came through emails, follow-up questions, and a final acknowledgement that the private event tip records did not match what servers had actually been paid. The complaint made the owners stop calling the shortages a personality conflict between a former employee and her supervisor. They had to look at the pattern itself. Our closeout emails, the server records, and the dates all pointed to the same thing. Then came the part I cared about most. The owners had to repay the servers. It was not limited to me, or to the people who had been brave enough to send records first. Anyone whose records showed a shortage had to be made whole. Former employees were contacted. Current servers checked their amounts. People who had once compared numbers in whispers began comparing repayment messages openly. There was something almost painfully fitting about that. My supervisor had used private event deposits to make herself look indispensable. She wanted the owners to see her as the person who brought in money, cleaned up the numbers, and kept the staff in line. Instead, those deposits led straight back to the missing tips. The nightly reports she had treated as routine paperwork became the map for paying people back. I never saw her face when the pattern became impossible to dismiss, and I am grateful for that now. I did not need her humiliation. I needed a server to open a message and find money that should have been there all along. Every excuse about rounding had become a line item she could not explain away. The fallout was quieter than people expect. There was no grand speech from the owners, at least not one I ever heard. There were corrected payments, awkward messages, and a sudden change in the way people talked about the woman who had controlled every checkout. Her certainty disappeared first. Coworkers told me she stopped throwing out the word rounding, as if it ended every conversation. When someone asked for a breakdown, the question was no longer treated like an insult. That mattered more than it might sound. Her power had never been only about the money. It was the atmosphere she built around it. She made servers feel greedy for noticing a shortage. She made questions sound disloyal. She made the owners feel protected from details they should have been checking themselves. Once the agreements, policy, closeouts, and payouts proved the pattern, that pressure broke in the most ordinary way possible. People started asking to see the math and the governing record. I will not pretend the owners turned into heroes overnight. They had ignored warnings until the complaint made it harder to ignore us. But they repaid people, and that changed the balance in the room. The supervisor who once took credit for deposits now had the same events tied to a wage complaint. Every repayment stripped support from her old story. She was no longer the person who fixed problems behind the scenes. She was the reason the restaurant had to fix what happened in the first place. Healing did not feel like victory at first. It felt like sleeping through a night without replaying the moment I was fired. It felt like opening my laptop without my stomach tightening. For weeks, I had lived inside documents, dates, and other people's fear. Once the repayments began, I finally let myself step out of that room in my head. I took a job where the checkout process was explained before my first shift ended. I still ask questions. I asked them calmly, but I asked. The difference was that I no longer apologized for wanting to understand my own pay. After being treated like a problem for noticing a problem, that felt enormous. I also stayed close to some of the servers who helped me. We were more than coworkers by then. We had watched each other choose courage in ways that looked small at first. Someone saved an email. Someone sent a photo. Someone confirmed a number even though she was scared. That was how I rebuilt trust. It did not happen all at once. It happened receipt by receipt, message by message, with people who had learned that keeping a record could be its own kind of protection. I used to think karma had to arrive loudly. Now I think it often arrives as a forwarded email, a saved receipt, and one person refusing to feel foolish for asking a fair question. My supervisor stole more than tips. She made people doubt themselves, and she lost because the people she underestimated kept records. If you take anything from my story, take this. When your pay feels wrong, write down what you can, save records you are allowed to keep, and ask for an explanation in writing. I know how frightening that can feel when the person controlling the schedule also controls the story. If this story made you think of someone who needs that reminder, subscribe and share it with them. And tell me in the comments, if you had been one of my coworkers, would you have risked sending your records while she still controlled the schedule?